Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. Great to be back with all of you. It is allergy season for me, Darren. I am suffering day in and day out with I think it's the maple trees and the alder trees. They're having a great time outside. On top of that, where we live, and you know this, sometimes they do some controlled burns to kind of get ahead of forest fires, and that creates some additional fun pollutants in the air. So if my voice sounds a little bit scraggly, that's probably why. Other than that, things are going really well. Just staying busy at work. I'm grateful to have a job that I enjoy, although sometimes I'm having to do it more than I might want, but glad to have the work nonetheless. And otherwise, things are quite good. Everybody in the household's doing well. My kids are off this weekend at a robotics competition, so it's nice and quiet. What's going on with you?
Well, for me, a few things happening, actually. Number one, getting ready to head out to Austin for South by Southwest before long. Looking forward to that, seeing some people, being on a panel discussing nature of reality stuff and the notion of this being an interface of sorts. So I'm really geared up for that conversation, that kind of panel discussion. Looking forward to just running into people in general. And it's been a long time since I was at that festival, so I'm looking forward to being there in person. Also, some other stuff recently, organizing this retreat that's happening in the Mojave Desert in California in May. So that's all set up now and filled up basically with people. So it's entering the busy season for me in terms of travel. The next 4 months or so, I'm traveling different places every single month. So that's all exciting stuff because I get to have more of these amazing conversations.
Yeah, that's very exciting. Nice to have a full dance card ahead of you. So looking forward to hear how those things go. I know you've got a lot of things in the pipeline too. You always do. So looking forward to when those things come to fruition. Darren, it's an interesting time that we find ourselves. I think everybody who listens to the show regularly understands that, feels that probably on a very visceral, somatic level. We live in a very interesting time. I know we can kind of use that phrase a little bit flippantly, but I really do believe it is a dynamic time to be alive. A lot going on and a lot to not necessarily unpack, but just to shoulder, right? There's a lot that we carry with us cognitively, psychologically, spiritually, from the load of the dynamic energies that we are surrounded by. And I know we want to talk about some aspects of that and the degree to which human beings have a connection, if you will, want to use that kind of word, to the future. And I know we can talk about time as well, but the way in which we feel about our present and our future and our past and how those things are interconnected, and how they impact us and leave imprints upon us, whether we are aware of them consciously or not. And some are more consciously aware of those imprints than others. So I'm excited to get in this conversation. There's a lot of different directions we can go with this, but maybe you want to spend some time kind of mapping out the territory a little bit. What kind of landscape did you want to cover on the show?
Yeah, well, in some ways, this topic is very fitting for a Liminal Frames episode because we have ongoingly been engaging with the intersection, if you will, between the UFO phenomenon and religious history and religious lore. And this obviously plays into both of our backgrounds. In some ways, we're specialists in both those fields, and we are very intimately familiar with that intersection. And one of the ways that shows up is in this notion of prophecies, prognostications, the future telling. This is all part of it. And not only that, but in addition to that, as I was saying to you a few minutes ago, we have even specific incidents that for some people, they are seen as religious incidents or events, and for other people, they're seen as examples of the UFO phenomenon. And this begs the question, what actually is going on here? Are both framings too narrow and actually downstream of these human kind of conceptions that collapse in light of what we actually are going to discuss today? So this, of course, is timely. When I suggested this to you, you said, yes, absolutely. That sounds like a good topic. It's timely. And that's, of course, because we have in the hopper right now, people who said that something is going to happen soon. This has been predicted for years now. We're now getting to the point where it's going to be revealed one way or the other. This is obviously in reference to Chris Bledsoe and his encounters with the lady, and how there was a sense that something was going to happen. Initially, it was framed as Easter 2026. But then more recently, there's been a revision where the sense is, according to the astrological charts and whatnot, astronomical charts, this will actually happen more likely in the fall. But this is just the latest example of what has been a centuries-long, actually millennia-long kind of pattern where people have encounters with beings that seem to be beyond the frame, if you will, who not only give messages to human beings, but also talk about the future, what's going to happen. Often it's cast in the form of a warning. If you don't do such and such, then A is going to happen. If you do something else, then B could happen. Sometimes there's discussion around a period of tribulation followed by kind of a paradisal kind of era that follows that. Again, when we think about someone like Chris Bledsoe, who had a Christian upbringing, but then had encounters with the phenomenon, as we tend to frame it, we see an intersection, if nothing else, because that's how he makes sense of it. And of course, then he's going to use language that the rest of us have to deal with in terms of making sense of what this is. And that will obviously play into how we compartmentalize and pull apart the way he makes sense of the experience versus what actually happened. And we can really get into this. And I also want to say before we start here, before I hand it back to you and we get into some specifics, is that some people, I think right away, land too quickly in one of two camps, which is either, absolutely, I totally believe in this, it's going to happen. Other people who say, never trust this. Either it's people that are not credible, people that are looking for fame and fortune, or they're being duped by a trickster phenomenon that never pans out. I think both of those extreme perspectives don't bear out in the data. I think when you look at the data, it's much more complex and much more interesting because there are times where prognostications, even prophecies, do pan out, though often not quite like people expect them to, which of course, this puts us right in the middle of Liminal Phrames territory because that begs deeper questions about the nature of reality itself. So let me hand it back to you for some reflections on prophecy and how that intersects between these two different domains we often talk about before we jump into specifics.
Yeah, I've got a lot of different thoughts to touch on there with prophecy. Like you mentioned, growing up, it was very much part of the cultural mix in a way from my Christian upbringing. That prophecy was certainly a part of the Christian tradition, still is. Although many Christians may not believe that that prophecy was sort of a one and done thing in the Bible, doesn't happen anymore. That all things were just allegorical and not truly prophetic. But nevertheless, it was part of the mix of things that was being talked about and thought about in my circles. What were these prophecies and what did they mean? And deciphering the language, trying to decode the prophetic writings that are in the Bible was sort of a constant effort, and some would say maybe an effort, a futile one, but it very much became like a cottage industry in a way, like what does this prophecy mean? What do these seals mean? What do these figures mean? I'm sure you're thinking about all kinds of examples growing up when that was talked about, and it seemed like it was the hot topic for most Christians when they wanted to study the Bible. They wanted to look at the books of Daniel, they wanted to look at the book of Revelation, want to know, what does it mean? When is Jesus coming back? What is Russia in here? Like, I mean, there's so many, or at the time it was the Soviet Union, right? There were so many different facets to biblical prophecy. And so interesting growing up with, being exposed to that kind of content. And at the same time, living in a world that very much had a scientific bent, like these are things that we can study. These are things that we know, fortune telling, looking into the future, this Nostradamus kind of stuff. Like, this is just purely, it's basically fun in a harmless sense, or it's harmful if people buy into it wholesale and they end up selling all their possessions and going off to live on a farm somewhere, and then they end up checking out by drinking a drink or whatever. Like, we all can recall, or you and I can recall, not every listener probably, the Hale Bopp situation, and of course before that, the Jonestown situation. And there are many others like that, where you have very charismatic individuals who have received prophetic messages about the future, and some of those prophecies do actually come true. And so they end up gaining some credibility because of that ability to predict the future events. and they gain followers, and that it continues to grow and grow. But they ultimately culminates in this one major prophecy that this thing is going to take place. And trust me, like I've been right before, so I'm going to be right again. And lo and behold, they weren't, right. So the American, I think, public has become quite skeptical of prophets in the modern sense of the term. Even I would say from a secular standpoint as well. So there are other aspects of this from market predictions, right? So I have a little bit of a background in finance and have family who've been in finance. And you know that people like to make predictions about the market. Is the stock going to go up? Is the stock going to go down? The economy is improving. Is it not improving? Are we in a recession? Are we in a boom period? All these things are constants in our day-to-day life, and these other types of prognostications of the secular kind have a bearing on the way in which our society runs, believe it or not. I mean, every day people sit down at trading desks and they make decisions on whether stocks are worth buying because they think they're going to go up or they're going to go down. On top of that, I think those of you who've been paying attention to more current events, you understand there is a new kid on the block called Poly Market, which you can go on and you can basically place bets on all kinds of things taking place in the future. So we like speculating about what's going to happen in our future. And we like when we're right, and of course, we bemoan when we're wrong. Everybody wants to be right all the time. But you take that desire, you wrap it up into this notion of prophecy and the end of times, the end of civilization, apocalypse. All these things are really exciting aspects to explore, and they get people engaged in the current events and in the world. But what is their power? What is their truth? And is it an either or is it a both and? And I think, like many of our episodes, this is very much a both and, meaning that some of these prophecies can be wrong, but also can be right in certain other areas. And our feelings about the future, or maybe our subtle dis-ease about the future, is coming from a legitimate place, not necessarily one that we can say with 100% certainty it's because of X, but it is coming from a legitimate place somewhere. We can explore what that means, what that territory might look like, and why we might feel that way right now. So a whole lot of things to get into here. We can go in a lot of different directions, which is always a fun aspect of the show. So we're just going to see where it goes. Darren, where do you want to start?
Well, a couple of thoughts just in reflection on what you said there. Number one, not only is there an intersection between the UFO phenomenon and religious lore and religious history, but you also talked about our society and the way our society runs partly by prognostication when it comes to fortune telling or future forecasting for markets and things like that. And poly market's an example where you can, for instance, bet on the likelihood that the US government will disclose that aliens are real, for instance. This is actually something you can bet on now. Well, in addition to that, this is not just an academic exercise. We like to get into the weeds in this show, but in very real ways, this plays in because, for instance, right now, putting in one stew here, everything you kind of mentioned there, we hear word that the defense secretary, or the secretary of war, as it's been christened more recently, is apparently even telling soldiers, different people in the military, that they should see this current war that's going on in the Middle East as potentially the apocalyptic war, the war that was actually depicted in the book of Revelation. By the way, thank you for using the singular term. That's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Everyone says it's plural. It's actually singular, book of Revelation. And he's actually saying that we should look at this as the end times war, and this could actually usher in the return of Jesus. This is literally being said in our government right now. So we've talked before about the Collins elite and how they've kind of stonewalled deeper investigation into the UFO phenomenon because they see this as a demonic kind of thing, and they don't think it's a good idea to open the door. Well, this just demonstrates how common that kind of thinking is. And when you have a culture like ours, where a subset grows in fundamentalist evangelical circles, they're going to go on and govern according to that worldview. This is what happens. So it's certainly not just an academic or an interesting thought exercise. This has real consequences in our world right now. All right, so before we get into a couple specific cases and we'll sort of weigh how the prognostications played out, whether or not it was actually backed up with fact or not, whether things came true or not, let's first talk about future telling in general as it relates to the UFO phenomenon. Because what often happens, I would say what usually happens actually, within the abduction phenomenon, for instance, is that different experiencers are told or are shown or intuit visions of the future, what's going to happen to the planet. And there's often this sense, as you know, that this is basically an intervention at some level that's meant to help us change course. Now, of course, that raises deep questions like, why does some guy who's a farmer in South Dakota get chosen to have this particular experience? Wouldn't it be better for a politician or someone in the levers of power to have that understanding so they could actually perhaps create policy around it? This is one of the ongoing questions. I remember one of the points I made when I spoke at the conference in New York in 2022 was that I think that because we have a shared consciousness, even when it happens to some farmer in South Dakota, whether we actually read a case about it or not, it becomes accessible to our collective consciousness. And this slowly bends the course of human history. And of course, this factors into, again, Jacques Vallée, who almost shows up in every one of our episodes, his notion of a control system. Is this future telling part of the control system, part of the way that it actually steers things one way or the other? Which raises an even deeper question that I would like us to address over the course of this episode, which is to, I would say, expand the possibility space and consider that it's not just about whether or not it happens or it doesn't, it's true or it's not, but what else might be the intention beyond whether or not it literally or historically actually happens the way it's being described. But let me first break down each of these key elements around the future and what's told to people or what they pick up about the future when they interact with NHI. So the first one, Nathan, is this idea that there's going to be planetary change in the future. This is often a global environmental kind of warning message. So the idea here is there's going to be impending ecological crisis, and experiencers frequently report being told that humanity is approaching severe environmental degradation involving the oceans, the atmosphere, the biosphere, etc. This was told to abductees that were studied by John Mack and Bud Hopkins and people like that. We, of course, hear about Earth changes, and this is not just ideas, by the way, presented to them, or telepathic thought even that's communicated to them. They often will see visions of the future. They'll see the world on fire, which in itself is interesting because surely that's symbolic because we're not likely to see the actual planet on fire, but that evokes a certain emotional response that, again, changes behavior potentially. That could be part of a control system. So Earth changes, geophysical upheaval, visions of floods, earthquakes, even pole shift type events that are shown symbolically during encounters. And the idea here is that humanity must change its relationship with the planet or face catastrophic consequences. So chime in, if you will, on that notion.
Well, I have a personal connection to this in my own background with the very vivid dream that I had when I was in my early 20s. You know, I don't consider myself to be an abductee or really an experiencer, but I had a very powerful dream. It was still the most vivid dream in my life. And in that experience, I saw kind of what we're talking about, the destruction of the earth. And it was very much an apocalyptic landscape. I was on a shoreline. It felt like I was on the coast, the East Coast. And I was looking at sort of the condo complexes that are often along the beaches there, and many of those had been sheared in half, like they had been sort of exposed. Those inner rooms had been exposed to the outside elements. The sky was very dark. There were orbs of light in the sky, and then the ocean was gone. Like the ocean had been pulled away, and so it was just the seabed that you could see from the beach. And this muddy, seabed going as far as I could see. And so when you talk about that, I think right away I go right to that experience, and knowing that's had a powerful impact on my own life, and the other aspects of that dream have had a powerful impact on my life, including one facet of it that preceded that experience, which was in fact an encounter with a gentleman that kind of looks like Chris Bledsoe. So it's a little bit strange to me, sort of seeing things happen now and see this man talking now in front of the cameras and then thinking back to that very vivid experience. Uh, so it's a great illustration. It's a great illustration of exactly what we're talking about. There is this experience and you're shown something and it feels very viscerally important to you. Like this is your planet. This is your home. These are things that you recognize and you're looking at this utter devastation and chaos and you're trying to make sense of where do I fit here and why am I observing this? And is this something I need to be aware of? Is it something I need to warn people about? Do I need to take action from this experience? Like, what is my takeaway? And in my own experience there, I did not have the sort of the classic experience that you hear from some abductees who've been shown this, where they come back from the experience and then they tell all their friends, or they change their lifestyle in dramatic ways, or they plant a garden, or they go on campaigns to try to wake people up, shake people up, because this is the end is coming. That really didn't happen to me. I definitely made a change that changed the trajectory of my life. I will say that, but it didn't end up becoming something that I was, proselytizing or evangelizing about to those around me. So, incredibly powerful, and I think when you're shown something like that, it can't help but shake you out of your normal day to day way of being, because it is so arresting, right? When you see images of the world on fire, or famines, or insert your concern of choice, you're going to be affected. You're going to be dramatically affected by that, and on top of that, you see hints of that in the biblical prophecy, right? You see hints of that and peppered throughout the prophecies in the Bible about disease, war, pestilence, all those kinds of things. It's designed in a way to get people to sit up, stand up, pay attention, because something is on the horizon. What is it? And maybe that's, I can think too here in my sort of secular education, that's that human programming, right? Always be a little bit concerned about what might be over the hill or lurking in the forest. Don't get too comfortable with the way the world is, because danger is always ever present. And if you're just too comfortable and naive about that, well, you're the one that's going to get eaten, right? So there is something in human programming that may be a little bit attuned to this. And we can talk about that too, whether that's, just solely the genetic imperative, or if it's coming from some other place. Again, a both and perspective.
Indeed, and in addition to the environmental collapse concerns and warnings and the visions like what you had in your dream that many people have experienced, there's of course also the nuclear element, and this very much ties into the UFO phenomenon in a couple different ways. But of course, the idea here is that there's concerns about nuclear war in the future and nuclear technology in general, and this repeatedly appears in contact narratives. At witnesses like Jim Sparks, who I did a POC episode on one time, reported being told humanity is dangerously close to self-destruction through nuclear conflict. So they specifically said that's what's going to be your demise if you don't change course. And of course, there's also this tie-in around interference with nuclear weapons systems. This is sometimes framed by experiencers as demonstrations meant to warn humanity, although it's an open question. When UFOs appear above nuclear silos and shut them down, or in some cases, as George Knapp often likes to tell us, one time turned them on and then turned them off again, what is the purpose there? Is that a warning? Is that a demonstration of power? Is that preparation for some event? We don't really know. It's open to question. And again, I think we should be cautious when people say it's obviously A or B or C in terms of what it means. Clearly, it's ambiguous. And some people have had specific directives that make them believe it actually is a warning. But the events themselves, number one, they're definitely historical, right? Speaking of these kinds of things. One of the aspects that is coming out in the governmental conversation around disclosure is this key historical piece that UFOs have shown up not just randomly, but very often around Air Force bases and as well around nuclear facilities, and actually, again, have been able to shut down silos. And in addition, I want to point out there's a lot of evidence that I've come across that the weapons operators themselves that are down in those silos, right, that are the ones that are charged with flipping the switch at the end of the day, receive telepathic contact and sometimes have actually been kind of frozen and not able to act because of what's basically interfering with them and their consciousness. So this is a real concern, and for some people, again, it's a promise. It's a hopeful thing because they're aware that they think they're trying to stop us from catastrophically destroying ourselves. And of course, this also plays into the notion that some people lean on, that because these others that are more powerful, that are technologically further ahead than us, who have these remarkable capacities to control our systems, both individual consciousness, collective consciousness, and our weapon systems, there's some hope that even if we were to try to start a nuclear war, they wouldn't let it happen. But right alongside that, though, Nathan, is people that we know, experiencers who have been told it's a foregone conclusion. There is going to be a catastrophe of a global scale, and the world is going to end. And the good news is we'll come and pick you up on the way out before it all goes down. And of course, in light of some of what you talked about earlier, when I like the way you framed it, we can say right now we live in interesting times, but they're quite daunting times. It's a really incoherent time to be in the world, more so than I think in any time in our lifetime. You could very much argue, in light of all of this, around whether or not the state of our civilization is worthy of keeping in its current state, because we are so catastrophic in our infighting and what we do to the planet, what we do to the biosphere, and those kinds of things. So I know there's some experiencers who have said, enough already, let's just reset, which I think for some people will be shocking, who think that at all costs we must keep this going. But of course, if this is just one reset of myriad numbers of resets, then you maybe look at it differently, especially if you don't see you as being limited to this body. So I said a lot there. Let me get you to riff on just the nuclear aspect in terms of the warnings, but also how frequently UFOs have shown up over nuclear facilities.
Right, we hear about this all the time in the accounts from the 20th century, and even recently we've heard that this is still happening. That these drones, quote unquote drones, orbs, vehicles, UAP, are still seen over some sensitive nuclear facilities. So there clearly seems to be a strong connection. We also have heard about this from books that have been published in the last few years. There were experiments that were designed to try to lure in UFOs by using nuclear material. So using a nuclear powered aircraft carrier, for example, as kind of a bait for the UFOs, the UAPs. So that's certainly been part of the conversation. What is it that they are attracted to? Why are they always or seemingly often present around these kinds of facilities? Think too of Fukushima. There were reports that there were UFOs or orbs of light seen in Fukushima, Japan, after that incident. Very, very curious activity from these craft, and I think then it becomes a question of what might their motive be. What is the association? How often does it happen, and why? Why do they seemingly appear at these locations? More it seems so apparently more often than not, and so there have been a lot of speculation about why that might be. Okay, some have said, oh, this is what an adversary would do if they were scouting out your capabilities, right? They would be surveilling your sensitive facilities. They would be looking to see how many warheads that you have, how safe and stable is your reactor complex, what is the power output there, what is the tech level, what is the tech level and the armament level of this civilization. And they're doing that as a scouting report. So they can report back to their sort of mothership that this is what the humans have, and this is the kind of response we might get if we tried to invade, right? That's the alarmist, I think, concern. The other one is that it comes from a standpoint of these aren't necessarily adversarial forces. These are forces that are, in a way, kind of looking out for humanity, trying to take care of us or be caretakers of the human beings. And we're playing with dynamite when we don't really know what we're doing. We're sitting on a big pile of TNT. We don't know that we're playing with matches while we're doing that, right? So maybe they're trying to look out for us and keep us from blowing ourselves up, and also there's the other angle of that. It might not be about us at all. It's about the planet, right? The destruction that nuclear war would wreak havoc on the biosphere, and the planet is precious. And then why is the planet precious? Is it precious because they want our resources, or is it precious because they may be also here? They cohabit the planet with us, or maybe it's something else entirely, or maybe it is all of the above. These are all kinds of questions that get thrown around when you talk about the connection between the nuclear sort of threat and the UAP UFO narrative. The other thing I wanted to mention too, I think, is that it's these sorts of prophecies and these sorts of cataclysmic concepts are also part and parcel for individuals who feel quite powerless, right? So there's something that we don't necessarily, I don't know how much time we need to spend on it, but it is certainly part of the conversation that those who tend to gravitate the most toward prophecy and toward these sort of cataclysmic prognostications are those who have maybe the greatest beef with the current status quo. That they'd rather everything fall apart and something new rise from those ashes than continue to persist in a world that they might find to be unjust or unfair, and they don't like what they see, right? I think it can be all this. It can be, certainly can be that, but it can be all the things. So I want to make sure to touch on that, and maybe we can come back to it. But it's certainly a part of the prophetic conversation.
That's right. And I'm glad you brought up Fukushima, actually, because that's a good example of something where there does seem to have been some degree of intervention, you could argue, that wasn't just them showing up, because there are reports that the radiation leakage levels went dramatically down right after they were seen. And you can literally see the footage of these lights up in the sky outside of Fukushima above the ocean. And apparently, soon after that, the radiation levels went down. So they may have literally intervened to prevent something much more catastrophic from happening. And that's certainly hopeful for all of us. But I completely concur with you that there's open questions around why they would be doing that. And them cohabiting the planet could be a big one. I also want to throw in something that we discussed a couple times ago in terms of the niche kind of vocabulary we use in this topic, and that's the idea of the shadow biome. We have heard before that when you detonate nuclear bombs, even in testings in the American Southwest, the reason why they started showing up is because they said you were causing damage to the shadow biome, to dimensions of reality, if you will, that you're not even aware of. So you're playing with toys that are not only dangerous in terms of dynamite, but they are also impacting the field itself, if you will, the fabric of reality in ways that are consequential that you're just not in touch with at this point. All right. Now, in terms of, again, things to do with the future and what's coming and all of that, another key component that is discussed, that is pitched to experiencers or that experiencers intuit, is a sense that there's a coming shift in human consciousness. So this will be a positive one. So the idea here is that human consciousness is going to evolve or expand in the future, and that is imminent. And some experiencers report being told humanity will move towards greater telepathy, empathy, and unified awareness. So again, psi capacities go up, and as that happens, it increases our sense of belonging in this unified field, and we begin to cooperate better with each other, with the planet. And at that point, we're often told then and only then will we be ready to be introduced to the larger galactic community. This theme also appears in contact narratives involving people like Chris Bledsoe and in the accounts that are gathered by John Mack. I also want to add that there's another wrinkle to this. There are some people, and this sort of falls within the corpus of Dolores Cannon, who would argue there's going to be a kind of bifurcation. This also shows up in the raw contact material. The idea that some people that are ready will actually ascend to this 4D or 5D kind of dimension of reality, while other people that are not at that point are not going to be punished, but they will exist in some other 3D context. And the notion, for instance, in the raw contact material, and this is also talked about in Dolores Cannon, I should say, is that the planet itself is alive, is consciousness, and it is already moving or has already moved to a new dimension of consciousness, if you will. And because of that, Those who are ready will populate the planet. Those who are not compatible with that, again, it's not a punishment, it's a compatibility issue, they will be sent elsewhere to continue their development in a 3D kind of context. So not only is there this notion that there's going to be this waking up, this grand awakening for humanity, but for some people it looks more like a bifurcation, that some will and some won't. But this is definitely in the lore, Nathan, so speak, if you will, to this aspect.
I mean, left behind, that's where we want to go right away, right? So you have those who are taken, those who are left behind. Yes, so there is this sort of sense of the chosen, or this rising of consciousness, this transition into a greater awareness. There's a rendering of the veil. So there's also this sense in the literature that the world in which you inhabit, the world the way you think the world is, the way that you perceive it, is all an illusion, is a mirage, and that there's a greater, deeper truth that is hidden behind this veil. And part of the apocalypse, the cataclysm, is this new knowledge, right? It's sort of it's baked into the terms. Like it's not necessarily an ending. It's a making known. It's a revealing. It's the revelation, right, of what is true. So there is, I think it's often conflated with, oh, this is bad news. It's all over. Like the world's just going to explode and it's done. But really, truly, it's sort of meant to be an initiation and ushering into a new cycle of human experience, one that is more deeply in tune with the way the world really is, the way reality truly is. So, it's an interesting concept to explore, and I think you can, I can't say what it would have been like to be living in some of the greater transitional periods in human history, like kind of be situated in those times and be on the verge of that great change. But I feel like right now in human history, we can feel that change is very much imminent. Like the potentiality for great change in the world is very much present to all of us, whether we are attending to that or whether we are subconsciously absorbing it through all of the content interactions that we have. The Epstein fiasco is a great example of this as well, where I think the average person is looking at that unfolding of information and going, wait, like there's a whole separate sort of tier of the way things are done and run, and the justice and injustice. Like there are people who run the world who seem to operate at a level that is above the norm for anybody else, and there are no repercussions to their behavior. And not only are there no repercussions, but they actively collude with one another to orchestrate things in our world to meet whatever desires they happen to have, whether that be, investing certain monies in certain directions or dampening inquiry into other directions. That there very much is this shadow hand at work in our world. So there's a corollary there in the prophecy, in the prophetic literature and tradition that we see playing out right in front of us. And so I think that, you kind of would be naive to think that that there's not some truth to that we're living in a time where our awareness has a great potential to expand and to be more clear, also with AI. So, to what degree will AI be a great revealer to us of truths that are hidden, that are obscured from our normal vision by its ability to collate information and draw connections and bring to the surface these deeper truths that have always been present, that just we have been blind to see. So there's this, again, I like to use this word because I think it's so apt, this great potentiality to this moment, this rising awareness, this increasing of consciousness, this expanding of our ability to see the true nature of reality. I think that that's all there and very much at the doorstep right now.
This, I think, actually very much dovetails with our last episode when we talked about some of the parallels between certain biological substrates and how that also impacts anomalous perception. I think that actually, and someone like Dolores Cannon actually talked about this, and I understand this is controversial. This is tricky to talk about, but she talked about some people coming in, these waves of volunteers coming in so that they would be a part of this process, not just helping to spread the good news, if you will, but just literally by hosting a different frequency on the planet that would actually help with this process, which again, we're right at the intersection of religious history and the phenomenon here, because that was referred to as a harvest, which you and I know this is a term that's used within Christian history as well, what the harvest will look like at the end of the ages. It's fascinating because this stuff is interwoven in all of these different domains. And as I said before, very much at the forefront of what's happening in our society right now, both in terms of public conversation as well as policy making as well. So something I think we can maybe dovetail to now is where this is all going. And then from there, we'll switch in the second half of the show to two specific cases we're going to break down a little bit. But I guess what we could introduce now is, where is this headed towards? What is going to happen in terms of this intersection or this conjoining of elements of the phenomenon with humanity? So one possibility is open contact. So as much as we talk about ongoingly, is disclosure going to happen, yes or no? Of course, at any moment, the beings themselves could make their presence known, and this would be open contact. So we can talk about that. There's also, of course, a different future that doesn't involve open contact. It actually involves quite the opposite, and that is cyclical civilizational reset. So some experiencers describe being shown that human civilization periodically collapses and restarts, often either purposefully on a timeline, again, talked about within the raw contact material, these certain errors that happen, but also because we bottleneck and we lose the capacity to move into novel futures, and then there's a reset that happens. And this is sort of done by these elements that are above and beyond our space-time construct, if you will. These visions sometimes involve previous human civilizations and previous technological eras. So we have the first notion is open contact in the future, the second notion being civilizational reset, and the third one is hybridization and a future humanity that involves these beings being here and perhaps even humanity not being exactly the same humanity that was there all along. So a commonly reported message is that human and non-human genetics are being combined to create a future species. We talked about this in our last episode. And for people like David Jacobs, these reported abductees are describing a future hybrid civilization living on Earth or elsewhere. So that's a bit more of a nefarious framing, that we're slowly being replaced at a genetic level. So it's not a direct literal invasion from the sky like Independence Day, but it is nevertheless a slow shift towards alien genetics over original human genetics. Although, again, as we talked about in our last episode, you could argue that we're already all hybrids and that the intervention's been happening since the very beginning, or at least since they perhaps took an initial hominid and augmented them in some ways. So those three possibilities for the future, Nathan, if you'll riff on those.
Yeah, it's a lot. um, I mean, I like exploring all of these. I think they're really fascinating, and they speak to, as you discussed, different aspects of the lore, and it's interesting to observe individuals who interact with the content, kind of which camps they tend to gravitate towards. The cyclical reset is certainly, I feel, gaining a lot of popularity in sort of our circles. That there's this notion of the magnetic pole flip and the magnetic excursion and the rotational of the crust and the tsunamis, and the sort of clean slate wiping off everybody off the planet. Like, this is definitely part of the literature, and it's part of the, I guess, alt human history that is being discussed or explored through the folks like Graham Hancock. But they like to talk about this, the cataclysms in the past, right? That there have been these cataclysmic experiences in the human history, and they've changed civilization, and the fact the Earth is quite old, and that there have been civilizations that have come and gone and have left no trace because geologic time is ancient. So there could be very many human civilizations or humanoid type civilizations that have persisted on the earth, some may have been more advanced than our own. And through time, they have sort of been erased from the surface of the earth. So it's very possible that that is part of this equation here. And then what kind of residue has that left on the human psyche, right? So if there's a cataclysm of that order, and there are humans who or beings who've survived it and been able to uh, record that experience, what would that recording of the experience translate into? It translate into kind of the mythologies that we've inherited about great floods and things of that nature. So it's certainly a hot topic right now. And I think if you're not a little bit unsettled by it, then you're just not aware of the amount of literature that exists about this very possibility, both in sort of our mythological traditions, but also even in the geologic record. There's some oddities there that are a little bit concerning. The open contact is interesting as well. Sometimes these things kind of blend together, that there is open contact before the cyclical reset. And as you alluded to earlier, some individuals may be spirited away following the open contact. So they're not left on the planet to endure the cataclysm, they're taken away. And you hear that not only with abductees who've had, been exposed to things or told things by their captors or their abductors that they will be taken care of, they will be renditioned off the earth. But you also hear about that in the literature, in the mythological literature. The Bible talks about this as well. We joked about it earlier, the left behind, and these are the people who are taken up in the rapture. And so there is a kind of open contact happening there between non-human intelligence and the inhabitants of the earth. And then right before the cataclysm comes, many people are taken away. The hybridization, also so many elements there that are both within UFO lore, but also within the traditions, the human traditions, about interbreeding with angelic beings or giant beings. It's throughout the literature there. So I think the big questions that come out of this, Darren, for me, is what is true, right? What is true to these accounts, to these experiences, and who's right? Well, which one of these is right? How do you make sense of that? How do you parse all of these different possibilities and give kind of weight to one over the other, or maybe none or all?
You reminded me of this book, this document that also was circulating called the Adam and Eve story, which isn't actually the biblical narrative that we're all familiar with. It's actually a researcher, someone who is a geologist, apparently, that had put together exactly what you talked about, these resets that had happened in the geological record. And there was some suggestion that we're on borrowed time and that we're actually overdue for one of those resets. But the point is, what's really interesting, you might remember with that, is that supposedly that book was actually classified by the CIA at some point. And furthermore, some people say that still some parts are redacted. So the question is, why is the CIA, if that's true, and there actually is evidence suggesting this actually did happen, why is the CIA either classifying or redacting elements of a book describing a future, but based on a cyclical reset happening? You could very much argue that it's because they know this is going to happen, there's evidence for it, and they don't want to cause panic in the human civilization. So this is, as you say, this is everywhere you look. It's in religious history. It's in our governmental understanding of what's happening. It's in our ongoing dialogue with the UFO phenomenon. I also thought about Artie Six Killer Clark's work when you were talking about being spirited away just before the apocalypse, because there are cases there in the lore of apparently these small villages in South America that were about to be overrun by a volcano that was going to erupt that destroys the village. Now, according to this lore, these UFOs showed up and everyone in a trance-like state was walking in a very orderly way right into the UFOs and were whisked away, spirited away, to use your language, the night before the volcano erupted and wiped out the village. And of course, the destruction was so complete that they wouldn't have found even bodies because basically the entire village is gone. But the idea there is that they were saved and also perhaps taken elsewhere. They weren't put back on the earth afterwards. So it is everywhere. And it's not just about future prognostication. It's also based, apparently, in some lore on things that have already happened. And that also speaks to Atlantis and civilizations from the past, like you pointed to. Now, one way I would like to riff is around something I covered in the last POC, which is the Mothman prophecies. Of course, that word is in the title. And what's interesting there is that there definitely are prophecies that are made that pan out. So the very climax of the book, which I covered at the end of the episode, he has this strong sense that something's going to go bad, right? In fact, the final chapter is called Something Awful is Going to Happen. So many people were having dreams or nightmares. People pictured people dying, but again, never enough detail to necessarily prevent it. And right at a moment where he was tuning into the TV thinking one thing was going to happen, he thought this massive electrical failure was going to happen across the country. Right when the president was plugging in the Christmas tree at the White House, that didn't happen. But instead, he hears over the airwaves that the Silver Bridge leading into Point Pleasant, where all of this strangeness happened, had just collapsed and people had died. Dozens of people died. So in that sense, everyone there felt like absolutely this is what everyone was sensing was coming. But of course, their frustration, and this is also true for Keel, who described them as those bastards. And he says that because his sense is they knew and they didn't give enough detail to prevent it, just enough to haunt us with the notion that they knew. And the last thing I want to say too, and let you riff on this as well, is that of course, one of the things you realize, not just from the phenomenon lore, not just from religious lore, but from our most up-to-date science, and I talk a lot about this with physics and whatnot, is that time isn't what we think it is, right? So we first of all need to take this out of the notion that this is so strange. How could this possibly be? Surely the only time prophecy could happen or some sense of the future could happen, precognitive dreams and whatnot, is when some angelic figure from outside the construct comes in and gives you some sort of message. But we have all sorts of examples, and Eric Wargo's work does a great job unpacking this, where people themselves have precognitive dreams. You might have been having a precognitive dream with that amazing dream you had, or that daunting dream you had, startling dream. But he's been able to demonstrate that people who keep diaries, dream journals, find that 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years later, these things do happen. And what's interesting about that, and this is something I've talked a lot about, is that in our default mode of consciousness, space and time feel real. I've been in situations where I'm outside that construct. None of it runs like that. But even within a dream, the constraints are looser. And people often see the future, feel the future, know the future in a way that they don't in their waking consciousness, which is fascinating in itself, because we often, in traditional culture, conventional culture, what we were taught in school is that dreams aren't real, or if anything, they're just these weird ideas that populate in the mind from leftover fumes in the brain or whatever. But that doesn't comport with the data. And the data says not only are dreams meaningful, but sometimes they give us information that is actionable about the future. So there's a lot to get into, and I think we should unpack in a few steps how this all works. Let me just let you reflect on what happened with the Silver Bridge, what happened with Mothman, where we not only had things seemingly happening where time didn't work like it usually did, but even the boundaries of what usually is allowed to happen in the everyday experience of people seem to be totally turned upside down too, as if that veil you had talked about was ripped wide open and something from other worlds came in.
Right. There's a sense in which during that entire incident that the normal rules which govern the way life works and the way relationships work, those rules get distorted, and things interject into reality in ways that are completely novel and unexpected, and to use one of our favorite words, discombobulating. But they also tend to be they have a revelatory quality. They provide an insight into something that is present or near or imminently present in that environment, right? So what is it that causes that precipitates that experience and disrupts the normal flow of day to day, A then B then C, how does the foreknowledge of an event in the future intersect and penetrate into the present in such a profound, alarming, and sort of completely disconcerting way to the people that of Point Pleasant, right, who went through those experiences. So it's an amazing account, and I think that there are, I'm sure, countless other stories just like that in pockets in human history where these kinds of events have occurred, and you hear about it from, and they become kind of tropes in a way, like these encounters with a stranger, and the stranger, sort of arrived on the scene. Nobody knew who they were. They had this information, this knowledge. They shared it with somebody. That person turned around to thank them. They weren't even there. They were gone. And then all of a sudden, what they said, transpired, or they were able to, save somebody. These kinds of things are throughout the human sort of oral and written traditions of occurring. And as our friend Jeffrey Kripal likes to say, these impossible things, whether we think they can't happen, they apparently do. And so what does that mean about the nature of reality and the nature of this phenomena? And what does it mean about our understanding about what reality is to begin with? I think that is kind of the ultimate question. Is it really affronts our notions of what is normal and what is acceptable, because clearly these things do occur, and the frequency to which they occur, I think, is open to debate. But it's a little bit difficult for us to gauge, because we're not able to sort of evaluate every instance of these oddities that are happening throughout every human experience on the planet. What if we were able to do that? What if we were able to access that information and glean something out of it? I mean, here I think too, Darren, to what we talked about in the past with the random number generators and the remote viewing, and there's this ability of seeming ability for humans to tap into some kind of field of knowledge, of information that presents itself to us about the nature of reality. We tend to map that onto, oh, I had something about the future. I was given knowledge about the future, but I think we may have that framing wrong. I think it may just be knowledge about reality, and that reality is made present to us in a way that we kind of map to, oh, that is something I'm not supposed to know. It's supposed to be something that takes place in a future, and that's a very linear way of looking at it. So a lot to get into there, a lot to explore. I love this stuff because it really is, it's mind bending, and I think the other reason why I like it so much is it's present throughout, I think, all of our human experience. And people not only have had personal experiences with this, whether they categorize it in the way we might as an experience with the phenomena, or a religious experience, or what have you. Most people have an experience that is adjacent, closely adjacent to what we're discussing here. And if they haven't, they know someone who has. And if they don't know someone who has, they certainly have read about these experiences in human history. So really, really interesting. And I think it's funny in a way that we kind of laugh about them a lot. We sort of brush them off as like, well, isn't that kind of interesting? Like, oh, isn't that kind of a coincidence? Or isn't that, like, we don't really spend much time thinking about them. And perhaps we need to, because it's possible that those experiences speak more to the nature of reality than what we might call reality itself.
Indeed. In fact, I would like to unpack a little bit what happened with Keel and the way that he, in the end, basically blamed those beings, blamed those ultra-terrestrials. He blamed that one overarching intelligence that he thought was running the whole thing, all the high strangeness. He blamed them as if they knew, they teased us with how much they knew, and then prevented us from knowing enough to prevent the actual accident that happened. But I think, to the point you made earlier, that's actually the wrong way to look at it. I think this has more to do with the fact that there's bleed through constantly. So from my perspective, again, when I've been outside the construct, you realize that space and time, this is not just an idea that I'm entertaining here. You actually experience realities not having space and time that way. And everything is just this oneness, this unit of experience. And so what we often find in the lore, as you and I both know, is that when people come back from some sort of religious experience or from some experience of the UFO phenomenon, they often are precognitive. They start tapping into the future. Now, sometimes those people feel tormented because they say, why are you giving me enough information to know something's going to happen, but not enough to prevent it? To give an example that I talked to you about before we started recording, I think about the case of Elizabeth Crone, who wrote a book with Jeff Kripal. She was going into a synagogue in Houston and got struck by lightning, had a near-death experience, was encountering this grandfatherly being or person she did sort of identify as looking like her grandfather, that you could also say played a kind of godlike role and father god kind of role. When she came back, she began to have precognitive dreams of the future. Now, it's very easy for us to write on to that narrative, add to that narrative, okay, she was being given gifts to help people, to prevent tragedies from happening. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. She just had her constraints loosened, so she was tapping more into the way reality actually is, where there is no space and time. And these things can bleed through and do bleed through in ways that you will pick up components or elements of it. But it's neither that it's because some angelic or godlike figure is trying to give you gifts so you can prevent things, nor is it because there's the demonic or trickster-like phenomena trying to give you just enough to tease you and never give you the full goods. It's neither of those things. It's just a bleed through from the way things actually are. So I look at this very, very differently when I think about all of these things and how we frame them. And speaking of that, though, I do think there is this overarching sense that outside of this construct, there are other elements of consciousness, which are obviously all refractions of the one original unit of mind, that are interceding in our space-time construct. And we are constrained in certain ways that we usually walk through the world in a linear fashion. They will sometimes come in and interject or seed certain things to steer things one way or another. And I think that's going to play into these next two cases we're going to talk about, because I would suggest that these are both examples of that. One is framed within religious history. The other is framed within the UFO phenomenon, although again, there's other parties involved that would say one is the other and vice versa. So the first one we want to talk about, because again, it's interesting because there is credible evidence that there was future forecasting that came true in this incident. And it has to do with what happened at Fatima, the miracle at Fatima. So in this case, there were several predictions that were made. So for those of you who don't know, although I think many of you do, we actually did an episode on this. There was a female figure that these young children in Fatima, Portugal, took to be the Mother Mary, because of course they were from a Catholic background. That's what they're going to think, of course. This will play into perhaps how Chris Bledsoe makes sense of his case as well. But not only did she appear to them, and only over time did they gather who she was. She certainly didn't declare from the get-go, just so it's clear, I'm the Mother Mary. They kind of leapt to that conclusion, you could argue, and to some degree, maybe she played with that notion. It's difficult to know because the reframing of the event happens over time, and some of the details don't get filled in until after one of the girls that was the main contactee had been a nun and part of the Catholic Church as an adult for decades. So it's difficult to know how much was added after the fact, whether deliberately or not. But I want to talk about some of the specific predictions that were made, because this has to do with what we're talking about with future telling here. One of the predictions made by this figure, this lady, was that there is going to be the end of the war soon. So this, of course, happened in 1917, so it was during World War I. So the lady reportedly said that the ongoing war would soon end. And again, the context is that the First World War was, of course, fought between 1914 and 1918. This was happening towards the end of 1917. What was the outcome? Well, the apparitions occurred in October of 1917, and of course, the war ended in November 1918 with the armistice of 11th November 1918. So, degree of fulfillment, perhaps you would say moderate. The war did end relatively soon after this prediction, though it was already widely expected that it would end pretty quickly at that point. Let me mention a couple of the other ones, and then I'll get you to riff on them. The second prediction involved the possibility of a worst war arising if humanity did not repent. Again, that repent word, of course, is very familiar for Catholics. So if people did not stop offending God, is what was actually said, a worse war, quote unquote, would begin during the pontificate of Pope Pius XI. What was the outcome? Well, of course, the next global conflict, known as World War II, did begin in 1939, and Pius XI's papacy ran from 1922 to 1939. The war began months after his death, but during the same geopolitical buildup. So, degree of fulfillment, often considered strong, at least by believers, though critics note that the wording was recorded years later, again to the point I made earlier, and could be interpreted rather broadly. Next one, prediction of a night illuminated by an unknown light. So, a great and unusual light in the night sky would signal that God was about to punish the world with war, famine, and prosecution. This is what the children were apparently told. The common interpretation is that this fits with the massive aurora that was visible across Europe on the 25th and 26th of January 1938. So, outcome. This occurred shortly before the escalation that led into World War II. Degree of fulfillment? Debated. The aurora was scientifically explainable, of course. It's a quote-unquote naturalistic event. You know what I think about those. But its unusual intensity made it notable, and some people say that this ties in. And then another one is the notion of Russia spreading its errors worldwide. This is one of the most compelling ones, Nathan, I think personally. The statement made by the lady was that Russia would spread its quote-unquote errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecution of the church. Now, there was a rise in global spread of communism after the Russian Revolution in 1917, which is when she was seen, when these apparitions happened. And the expansion of the Soviet influence during the Cold War, of course, did happen. And communist governments and ideological influence from them did actually persecute Christian churches. So, degree of fulfillment, this is often viewed as strong. Though critics note, of course, the revolution had already occurred months earlier. So again, there's always some debate depending on what your predetermined notion of reality is. Couple more, and then we're going to let you riff before we get to the final case. Prediction of persecution of the church and suffering of the Pope. So bishops, priests, and the Pope would suffer persecution and martyrdom. And during the communist persecution of religion in the Soviet bloc and elsewhere, this did actually happen. The Vatican later interpreted the third secret vision as symbolically referring to this event. This is the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II. So, degree of fulfillment, symbolic, perhaps interpretive, not a literal one-to-one prediction. And finally, the famous one that I think is really quite compelling, the miracle of the sun. The lady promised a public miracle in October so people would believe. What was the event? Well, a reported solar phenomenon witnessed by thousands of people. This is documented as happening, Nathan. It's really fascinating. On the 13th of October, 1917, known as the miracle of the sun, involved many bizarre things, the darkening of the sun, some other things seen, some other lights seen, including some seesawing things falling to the earth that, of course, are reminiscent of the UFO phenomenon. Even when we talk about a lady being seen in and around this part of Fatima, there were also UFOs in the sky, I want to point out, noticed weeks beforehand. So the outcome is that large crowds reported unusual solar motions or light effects. Degree of fulfillment, immediate fulfillment. This basically is a very strong case because thousands of people didn't see this, and it pretty much lines up with what she predicted was going to happen. So what do you make of that event, Nathan? I think it's one of the most compelling ones in history. Certainly makes you ask what is really going on with reality.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Fatima is truly fascinating, and there's a lot of documentation around that event it's difficult to wrestle with. I think you mentioned a couple of those that certainly the skeptics can say, well, these were superpowers, and there were tensions, and you could kind of get into that and make some predictions about what might happen, but the event itself, the miracle of the sun and the lady and the number of observers, like it's really quite fascinating. What makes me what I really wanted to speak to here is the fact that the Catholic Church has a tremendous amount of information related not only to this event but to many events that have transpired in our culture that I think the modern person has really just kind of written off, right? Like this is just sort of a giant institution furthering its own interests, concocting its own narrative, sort of patting itself on the back that this is all true. But there was also a great degree of effort within the Catholic Church to prove the veracity of many of these claims, because and it made sense for them to be able to do that. If they could investigate these incidents and gather information, testimonies, and review all that documentation, they had formal processes by which they would kind of canonize certain events as being authentic, right? And that gives them greater legitimacy, and that means they were also reviewing events like this and others and finding the evidence to be lacking, and therefore, not giving them the kind of credence or attention. So there's a lot of information within Catholic literature that I think is worth revisiting, because they have been willing to wrestle with events like Fatima and to make sense of those events, and have kept records in that process. Have they gotten it right all the time? Certainly not. But there are plenty of things in the record that are very hard to ignore. Um, Carlos Ayer wrote this book that many of us have cited before called They Flew, and you'll hear Jeffrey Kripal talk about that. And it's a great example where there are account after account after account of these saints in Catholic tradition who were apparently levitators, among many other feats, bilocation, all kinds of things. And you might go, I mean, that just sounds ridiculous, but there's a great deal of historical record that gives credibility to these claims from individuals who were not Catholic, who just happened to be present with these individuals when the levitations occurred. And so I say all of that to say that these kinds of impossible things do happen and do occur in our reality, whether we like to think they do or not. And I think Fatima is a great example of that, where a lot of people don't even know the story, but it's really quite compelling, quite amazing, and I think worth getting more attention. So I'm glad that you brought it up. It's a good one to explore.
It is. It's truly fascinating. I think you'd have to be a remarkably diehard skeptic to not think twice about the nature of reality after you hear about those experiences, especially when we hear about thousands of people, including many of the skeptics and cynics and debunkers, came to laugh at the people who believe these things could happen. They themselves had these experiences. And were often, again, because of the religious context, seen collapsing on their knees, repenting after this experience. By the way, you brought up that Carlos Ayer's book. I also want to bring up another book that people should totally check out if they're interested in exploring this further, and that's Ingo Swann's The Great Apparitions of Mary, an examination of 22 supernormal appearances of Mary, which relates to what we're going to talk about in this final case, and as we sort of close out this episode and riff on what this all means. And that's the case of Chris Bledsoe, which of course is talked about in the context of the UFO phenomenon, but you will find has a lot of remarkable consistency or overlap with what we just talked about with the Fatima encounters. So the prophecies attributed to Chris Bledsoe come primarily from communications he says he received from a luminous female figure he calls the Lady, which of course is exactly what we just referred to the being in Fatima as. According to Bledsoe, these communications began around 2012, several years after his initial UFO encounter in 2007. The prophecies are not a single detailed prediction, but a cluster of themes and specific statements he has repeated in interviews and in his book and also on podcasts. So here are the core prophetic elements associated with the Lady that Chris Bledsoe has encountered and interacted with. Number one, the Regulus Sphinx alignment prophecy. This is the most specific one. And the most widely discussed prediction involves an astronomical alignment, quote, when the red star of Regulus rises before dawn in the gaze of the Sphinx, a new knowledge shall come into the world, unquote. Key points associated with this statement: the star referenced is Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation Leo. The gaze of the Sphinx refers to the eastward orientation of the Great Sphinx of Giza, of course. Bledsoe says astronomers ran the alignment and concluded it occurs around Easter 2026. I think that's recently been reconfigured, and now again it's pitched as happening in the fall. He interprets this as a turning point in human history, most importantly, bringing quote-unquote new knowledge and the end of an old era, speaking to what you said earlier. And he has suggested the event could correspond, by the way, could correspond to a spiritual unveiling, a revelation about non-human intelligence, which he likes to depict as angels as opposed to aliens with ray guns, as we've discussed before, or the return or manifestation of Christ-like consciousness, or actually a Christ-like figure. So he has been vague, though, about when exactly this happens or what exactly happens, but these kinds of things. The second one is a coming apocalypse, and this is in the original sense that you spoke of, the unveiling notion, where Bledsoe often clarifies that the lady's message implies apocalypse in the Greek sense of apocalypsis, meaning revelation or unveiling, not necessarily destruction. Humanity will learn something fundamentally new about reality, consciousness, or the presence of non-human intelligence. In this framing, the event marks a transition in human understanding, not necessarily a catastrophe. Two potential timelines for humanity, according to what the lady told Chris. There's the apocalyptic timeline. Humanity enters conflict and chaos, resembling biblical revelation. And transformational timeline. Humanity shifts towards cooperation, love, and spiritual awakening. Now, which timeline manifests depends on collective human choices, according to Bledsoe's recounting. Warning about a deceptive alien threat narrative. Another message attributed to the lady is that some powerful groups will attempt to portray non-human intelligences as hostile invaders. Of course, we hear about other people saying the same thing. Stephen Greer. This narrative would allegedly be used to consolidate power or manipulate humanity. Bledsoe interprets this as a warning that a false hostile alien storyline could emerge. Restoration of the divine feminine. Humanity has suppressed the divine feminine principle. This imbalance is responsible for much of the world's conflict. Not much argument there, actually. The lady represents the return of that feminine aspect of the divine, and Bledsoe has associated the lady with figures such as Hathor, Virgin Mary, and various feminine archetypes across cultures. I'll have something to say about that a little bit later. Anyway, there's a lot there, Nathan. But again, the messages are coming from this lady that also was radiant, that bears a remarkable resemblance to not only Marian apparitions, but what was seen at Fatima. What do you make sense of with this case, which of course is in the news as we speak?
This lady is up to something. She seems to be pretty present, pretty active in human history. What does it all mean, and why? Right. So it's really interesting. I think there are a lot of different camps on the Bledsoe story, and you can see that play out in social media, both in criticisms. Both some of them warranted, I think, some of them a little bit extreme. I think that uh, I don't question the authenticity of Bledsoe's experience. I think that he had very much had a very real experience of the phenomena, a very transformative experience. One of his sons had that experience as well. His family went on to have additional encounters and experiences in the wake of that initial encounter that he and his son had. Yeah, I think that something real happened there. And then I think everything after that is sort of open to interpretation, and the event itself, of course, is open to interpretation. But how it's framed is very much influencing the conversation we're having around it. So there's a heavy influence of religious tradition on the experience that I think is pretty obvious and evident. Which is not to say that that is wrong. I want to make sure that I'm very clear about that. Just because I might come out and say, "Hey, like he's heavily tainted by his Christian, upbringing and his theology, and therefore, like, we can ignore everything that he's saying." That's not my position on this at all. I think we have to take it very seriously, but just recognize that it is part of the narrative and the interpretation that he is providing, and understanding what that is, and seeing it for what that is incredibly useful, because it helps to know what his state of mind is and sort of how that maps to the experience itself, right? Because there are things we can glean from his energetic impression of the experience, and kind of separate that to a certain degree from the interpretive layer. Like, "Oh, I think this was in fact the Virgin Mary," or this was in fact a proclamation about the end times and the return of Jesus, or these are in fact angels that are in these orbs, right? Are those things true? The picture is a little fuzzier than I think people might want to admit. I think what is the turnoff for me is kind of the heavy rhetoric around these experiences, that there's a strong desire for validation embedded in a lot of what Bledsoe and his family publicly share. And I get that. I think that makes total sense. I'm not, you know, I would be in the same boat if I were in their shoes. I would be seeking that validation and desiring that validation from people. And when these events start taking place, like they have been in recent days, where the United States has launched an assault on Iran and many other countries, right? And it's not just the only country that we've bombed in the last several months. But there's this desire to kind of wrap this into a cohesive narrative that makes sense of this chaos. And there are lots of places that we can go. The well is quite deep, where we can dip the bucket in and go, well, this is what this means. Like it's got this all, it's nice and tidy, and it's got this bow on the top. This is what this means. It means the second coming of Christ. It means, all these kinds of things. The interesting dynamic layer to this that is certainly part of why we find it fascinating, uniquely fascinating, is this UFO component, that there have been strong UFO, non-human intelligent experiences that Chris has had, that interlace with this very strongly Christian theological component. So how do you make sense of both of those things? And I think that you're going to have to, the audience and myself included, have to wrestle with those things and come to our own conclusions. So it's really dynamic. It's both and I think we're not done. We're not done kind of wrestling with the implications of what his experiences mean for us and for the way in which the world is right now. I also believe, before I turn it back to you, that, as I've alluded to earlier in this episode, that there are very real events that happen in reality that we like to think of as the future, but they are just part of reality as it is, that leave a residual impression on our collective consciousness. And that's because we are a part of that. We are tapped into that. And so we interpret that as a thing that's going to happen, but it is already in the field of knowledge. And that's something that we just have a presence to, and therefore are attuned to that kind of language. So I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and on that point, this is exactly why we shouldn't be surprised that perhaps one day, if not already, because again, there's open debate around when the events in the book of Revelation actually take place. You and I, of course, know that some people believe it had to do with what was happening at that time. Some people think it's about the end of our time. Some people think it's a combination of the two. But to that same point, this residue or this element of this stacked reality is available at any point. From one perspective, it looks like a sequential kind of ordering, but it also can arise as a different kind of ordering that's not sequential at all. And I've talked before on this podcast about how there have been times where I've had a reconstruction of my history where events organize semantically based on meaning connection rather than chronologically. And in fact, outside the construct, it works much more like that. So it's very much a later, after the fact rendering that makes things look linear and sequential. So I agree with you. We shouldn't be surprised at all that we often have access to elements that seem like they're from the future, which only seems impossible when you believe in linear time and you believe space-time is actually foundational. Now, a couple of points about Bledsoe himself. I want to contrast trustworthiness, general trustworthiness, from credibility, because I think these are two different things. And you kind of spoke a bit to this in the sense that you can be an honest broker, you can be sincere, you can be authentic and still be wrong. I like to say that sometimes. You can be sincere and sincerely wrong. And furthermore, you can sometimes have some elements of the truth, but sometimes, again, unbeknownst to yourself, you are interweaving elements of your own history or your interpretive system that you've inherited, which we all have. And I want to talk about that a little bit later because I think it comes in even in terms of how these beings interject in our reality and what that looks like. So someone can be someone who doesn't lie. They're not being deliberately deceptive, but they can still misconstrue events unintentionally. And I think that can happen here. Now, I also want to talk about something that I've also recognized because I've been in some of these circles, and that is that there can be influence from others. So, for instance, if you are having a really amazing, mind blowing experience, and then you are trying to make sense of it, not surprisingly, if people come to you in your circles and say, you know what, that's just like this one being from ancient history. I think it's that being. You might in that moment not say, yes, that sounds right. It might be the second or third time you hear it. But then suddenly one day in a podcast, someone asks you, who do you think the lady really is? Well, I think she's Sophia, this personification of wisdom in the ancient tradition, or something like that, right? Like I think I know this has happened in these kinds of circles with these kinds of people. I've seen some of it happening. It's not like they're trying to do a bait and switch. They're not trying to be insincere in how they respond. They're sometimes put on the spot. But just like any human being, they're going to be influenced by their context, not just the context of the life they grew up in, the religious tradition they grew up in, but also what people, including people from the intelligence community, in Chris's case, are saying to him about how they understand these things. So we shouldn't be surprised. And I often find it interesting in this field specifically when people say, so-and-so says it's this, whatever we're talking about. But often what they're doing is just reflecting what they've heard from 3 or 4 other people in the field. And sometimes we get this amplification effect where the same 4 people are actually echoing each other, and it seems much more well attested than it actually is. That's something else I want to say. My final point I want to make about the nature of beings like the lady is that from my perspective, and this might be surprising or controversial, or some people might not like this idea, I don't think she is actually a distinct permanent being, if you will. I think she's a manifestation that arises to teach a certain concept or interject a certain kind of data that subtly steers our civilization. And I think she arises within an archetypal form that sends its own kinds of messages before she says a word. So the fact that she shows as an epitome of the divine feminine, right? She's showing up as a personification of that, providing wisdom, acting with compassion, asking us to return to a sense of oneness. Not only does the message matter, but the form she arises in matters as well. And even Carl Jung talked about this. Why are there these archetypes? I think that certain kinds of meaning are best construed through certain archetypal kind of constructions. I think the reason we see this being across time is because it fits that archetypal construction. That for any of us, most of us anyway, hopefully, have a positive experience. Some of the most loving, warm experience we've had is with our mother. So it should not be surprising that the way this thing manifests, the way this information manifests, is in the form of a mother or the feminine. So that's something else to think about here. And I would suggest that these entities that populate from outside the construct into the construct are acting more like maintenance agents. And sometimes even when people say this particular being didn't even seem like they were fully there or they weren't ensouled, they were very businesslike, I think that's because some of these beings are not, again, even permanent, ensouled units of consciousness. They are actually arising, and they have to arise as something, right? So if something outside of space-time, where space and time don't exist, where the notion of physical beings doesn't exist, but within the construct that we experience here, under these constraints, when we see entities or we see units of consciousness, they always take a form, even if it's in the form of a light being. So in my sense, they appear as something, and sometimes when we go, they felt very businesslike or inhuman or that they didn't care. It's actually that they're functioning more like the way a maintenance agent would in a web server or something. But that need not be cold and calculated. I think it's actually interjecting information as the lady was in Fatima, as the lady is with Chris Bledsoe, that's trying to steer our civilization in positive directions. So there is this interesting intersection between you can't expose to too great a degree that this is all a construction, because then you will collapse the construct itself. But you want to selectively interject notions, ideas, directions, so that you can hopefully open up a more novel and fruitful possibility space. That's the way I look at the whole thing.
Yeah, I love that. And we're going to have to come back to that on a future episode. I think that there's a lot to dive into there that is really worth exploring. And I find I'll leave with this, that I think of the kind of the phrase resonance, and there's a resonance that happens with these kinds of events, with these impressions, and where those impressions resonate, in those who experience them, they take hold, and as they take hold, they become transformative, and they resonate, further, and that resonance is like an energy. It's so it can take a form, like we might go look, oh, it's a tuning fork, like that's how it resonates, but that's just one form that allows the resonance to manifest. And so we can get really wrapped up in what the form is and not the resonance itself. And I think that's the takeaway here, is that there is this resonant energy that is intersecting into our quote unquote reality, and we oftentimes conflate it. We flatten it down into this very boxy way of explaining it, because we crave this certainty. And so we come up with these explanations that it is this, it is that, it means this, it means X, but we're ignoring the imprint itself, the resonant energy itself. So something worth contemplating and worth digging into on a future episode. Darren, this has been a good one. I've really enjoyed this conversation. A lot to unpack, as always. I always come away with more to think about, which is really, really nice at the end of the week. So on that note, thank you for listening, and may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.